Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. You know, our country is again racing towards a debt ceiling. You'd think that President Biden would take the negotiations seriously, but unfortunately, he's taken 97 days to get together with Speaker McCarthy. As of right now, the only plan passed by either chamber to raise the debt limit is the House Republicans' Limit, Save, Grow Act. Unfortunately, reaching the debt limit, as mentioned earlier, isn't a new problem. It's one we repeatedly face and will face again unless we act to get our spending under control. Let's start with some basic facts we can all agree on. Our national debt's $31.4 trillion. We're borrowing one out of every $5 the federal government spends, which means we're borrowing about $50,000 a second. With my time at the hearings done, we'll have accumulated nearly $14 million more in debt. And every taxpayer is on the hook for over $250,000 in debt. These are the facts. I'm glad that we're talking about an agreement. I mean, that we, as stated earlier, we don't want the United States to default. I'm also glad, Director Mulvaney, that you helped clarify the definition of what a default was, because that sometimes gets thrown around loosely. And it's really not the best way to describe our situation. Since we do have revenue coming in, we're just spending more than what the revenue is. And the budget proposed by President Biden adds another $17 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. Think about that. Another $17 for over the 10 years would make our debt about $50 trillion. The sticker shock of the deficit spending only gets worse. If the government borrows $1 million today, the total cost to the American taxpayer is more than $2.3 million by the time that 10 years is up, because there is no plan to repay that money. And while the president proposes borrowing in mass sums of money, he's also included taxes as part of that, which is going to slow down the economy, which will impact the amount of tax revenue that comes in. You know, one of the things, even one of the Democrat witnesses in the House Budget Committee hearing last week admitted that people making less than $40,000 would need to pay more in taxes to help cover the cost of some of those wide-ranging spending policies from the Biden administration. And as we talked about earlier with tax cuts, one of the things I want to mention is, thank goodness for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. As we've seen now, actual tax revenues are coming in higher than what the Congressional Budget Office projected. In 2022, it was over $900 billion more than the CBO projected when the bill was passed in 2017. In 2021, it was roughly $200 billion more. And so actually the economy is turning in more tax revenue for us. So let's think about the federal spending sort of like a personal budget. If someone's making $48,000 a year, but spends $63,000 a year and carrying a $314,000 on a credit card, you think it's fiscally responsible for that person to go get another $15,000 on the credit card just to spend over the next year, just so they can overspend their debt limit? No, the first place we need to start looking at is how do we reduce our spending so that we can match that up with revenue. If we don't, we'll get back in the same point to where we are today. So the only responsible plan we have out there is the Limit, Save, and Grow Act that's been passed by the House Republicans. I'll note that this hearing today is how a U.S. default crisis harms American families and businesses. Nobody wants a U.S. default crisis. Nobody wants the U.S. to default, and we want to make sure that the bill that the House Republicans passed helps prevent that, and it's the only bill that's going to do that. And it helps strengthen our financial footing for the future. Mr. Mulvaney, when I came to Congress 6 years ago, the estimate was that if we could save about $6 trillion in a 10-year period, we'd have a balanced budget. Now that's roughly $16 trillion based on where we're at today. How do we address our out-of-control spending to actually make sure that we get back in the right direction?
How do you address out-of-control spending? You try and convince folks in the other party, and your own party, by the way, that spending is a problem. You can face it. You don't get $31 trillion in debt by one party doing it to you. There are folks in my own party who are just as eager to spend as some Democrats are. So yeah, you've got a fight to do. It's always easier to say yes. It's always easier to say yes. I can't tell you we went through, I was in the OMB, I know I'm over time, I'll tell you a story. We were down there one day when I was writing the first version of one of the budgets, and we were cutting pretty heavily. And then we got some instructions from up above to sort of spend a little bit more money. And I want you to know the meetings were a lot easier after that. when you can tell people, oh yeah, we'll spend more on this, spend more. It's really easy to spend other people's money, which is what y'all do, right? So you have to sort of figure out how to do the right thing and realize that you're spending your grandkids' money and not your own.
That's right. Make those tough choices. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.